Welcome to Lincoln House. I'm Armando Carbonell. I chair the Department of Planning and Urban Forum here at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And I see some familiar faces and some new ones, but welcome to our Lincoln Lecture Series. We're very pleased, as always, to bring one of our colleagues, in this case Jay Espy, who is a Kingsbury Browne Fellow, to share what he's been working on with a group of our friends from the region. I don't know, has anybody come in from outside the region? But
well, what do you consider the region?
Cambridge. Well, that's a very good question. Well, where did you come from?
Vermont.
Well, come on, that's the region.
See?
New England, you know. I mean, Jay had to come down from Maine, so.
Oh, that's New England too.
Yeah. It reminds me of, we had a program at the Federal Reserve Bank a couple years ago. We're going to have another one tomorrow. And I think it was Russ who pointed out that we had Poland Springs bottled water. And I said, well, Poland Springs, at least it's from New England. And it was not satisfying to Russ. I recall getting a long letter from him about that. But good to see you, Russ. And, so let me introduce Jay and mention a couple of things about the Institute and its connection to land conservation in New England and in the United States and in the world. The reason we have a Kingsbury Browne Fellowship is that Kingsbury Browne, who was a Boston lawyer and leader in land conservation, was a fellow at the Lincoln Institute on leave from his law firm. And out of his fellowship and his work came the Land Trust Exchange and ultimately the Land Trust Alliance. So going back to the beginning in terms of this particular movement, we've had a role, and we're very proud of it. And the Kingsbury Browne Award and Fellowship, which are given jointly by the Institute and Land Trust Alliance, recognize leaders in the field of land conservation. We've been doing it for several years and hope to continue to do it. And the fellowship involves an activity on the part of one of these distinguished conservationists that could include research or mentorship or otherwise contributing based on their experience and their knowledge to the field. And Jay, who I should tell you I've known through a Lincoln Institute activity that goes back maybe 20 years or more, something called the Land Conservation in New England something, leadership something, study group on land conservation in New England. I used to come up from Cape Cod to the old Lincoln House on Trowbridge Street, and we would meet with folks from around the region. And I'm very pleased that we're still in that business and still able to do this. So I've known Jay since he was with the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, where he was notably successful in raising money and saving islands, and also as a leader of Land Trust Alliance, chairman of the board, and now on the Canadian Land Trust Alliance, and in his current role as executive director of the Elmina B. Sewell Foundation, now a grant-making philanthropist. And he's going to talk to us about the connection between what he knows about land conservation and his current role as a philanthropist and the role of foundations in advancing land conservation in the United States. So looking forward to this. Jay's going to talk for a while, then we'll have some interaction, and enjoy your lunch as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Armando. Yeah, I think it was about 25 years ago, actually, that got started. And I think it really was one of King's brainchilds, as a matter of fact. I've only been in this room one other time, as I remember. And I think I'm right, Jim, but the time that I was here, you had invited E.O. Wilson to come and speak to a group of us. And he was talking about the work he was doing to inventory, catalog all life on Earth. Big thoughts were happening in this room, and I was kind of blown away. I hope you will allow me not to quite be as grandiose as that today. And I have to say, Armando, most of my career has been in land conservation. I've been now in the foundation world for just under 4 years. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about still is influenced by my knowledge of conservation. And growing knowledge around philanthropy. But as you mentioned, with the Kingsbury Browne Award that I received and the fellowship that I received, I began thinking, what can I do in terms of research and adding some knowledge to the field of conservation that would draw on my background in conservation and then this interest and growing knowledge in philanthropy. And one of the things I learned from foundation people in the past was a saying that if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. And that has proven to be true. But what I also knew is that I could not do this work of researching this topic alone. And so I engaged a young woman named Gina Schrader, who was and has recently now graduated from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So much of the research that's been done, not so much for this talk, but for a paper that I know the Lincoln Institute will be putting out, has been her work interviewing foundations and land conservation practitioners around the Northeast. We focused on the Northeast, although I think a lot of what she learned applies nationwide. So today I'm not going to really go through that research per se, but draw out one trend or theme that I believe is perhaps the most important theme with regard to where conservation might be going in the future. And so I'm going to focus on that today. And I think to be able to do this properly, I need to take you back a little bit and talk a little bit about the history of conservation, at least my fractured understanding of the history of conservation in the United States. And I see three major eras that we have been through in the United States in the conservation realm. Really in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was a period of the establishment of the national park system, the national forest system. A lot of public money and time and effort was put into securing lands that are public lands, the White Mountain National Forest, Acadia National Park, Yosemite, Yellowstone. All of those were done in that era. And as I should say, there's one exception, notable exception, and since I'm in Massachusetts, I need to mention it. But the Trustees of Reservations here in Massachusetts is actually the oldest conservation organization in the world. Not just in this country, but in the world. And I think it was 1891 when it was established. And the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests in 1900 or 1901 is the second oldest. And so there was some private conservation going on, but private conservation really got started in the mid-50s through today, but it really had its heyday, I would say, in the late 1970s through the early 1990s. And that was the boom of the land trust movement. The Nature Conservancy was one of the earliest private, not-for-profit conservation organizations in the country. And then we began, and there were others that were large scale of that nature that got started. But it really was in the 70s and 80s when we saw private citizens taking action to conserve lands that they felt were important in their region or in their community. And the ground zero for that was New England. Massachusetts, I think, has more land trusts than any other state in the Union. Maine, with 100, has the highest percentage or highest per capita rate of land trusts in the nation. And of course, that whole movement has spread, but it really emanated from this region. Then in the third era I'll speak of, I call landscape scale conservation. And many of you may know that there have been some very large landscape scale land conservation projects done, really beginning in the 1990s. And this was the era in which primarily what happened is paper companies, Wall Street recognized that paper companies had huge holdings of land that were undervalued on their books. And so there was pressure by those companies, timber industry, to divest itself of these lands that were not realizing the asset value that they had. Primarily what was happening was people were recognizing these were timberlands that had always been managed for timber and had been valued as if they were only timberlands. They had extensive shore frontage on lakes, rivers, some on the ocean. And clearly the value of the waterfront land was much higher than the timber value. And therefore these lands were sold off. The establishment of real estate investment trusts to buy these lands, and also something called TIMOs, those are timber investment management organizations that bought these lands, recognized that they could manage the timberland for its growth potential for harvestable timber, but as part of their model, they looked to divide and sell lands that would be highly developable lands, primarily for second homes. And so as a result of that, in New England in particular, northern New England especially, a great deal of land was sold off. In Maine, approximately 30% of the state changed hands in 10 years. That's 20 million acres, a third of that changed hands in about 10 years. That was a very frightening time for a lot of people who were concerned about what's going to happen to this land. It's always been there. It's always been relatively wild, although wild is a strange term and you have to be careful with it, but it was land that was available to the public through the tradition of public use of private land. What was going to happen to this land? Well, at that time, there was also a convergence of some big risk-taking and some big bets being made by the Nature Conservancy and others to acquire large-scale landscapes. Andy Fallender's organization, AMC, was one of the players who purchased a large blocks of land. And so in a period where people were very frightened about what was going to happen to the North Woods, more land was conserved in that 10-year period than ever before in the history of New England. So these three eras have really brought us to where we are today, with a very solid base of conserved lands throughout New England and in the United States. But where are we headed? What's next? Can this continue? I think pieces of this will continue. There still continues to be interest in public lands. Certainly land trusts are active in communities throughout New England. And there are some landscape scale opportunities still available. I'm going to talk about one in a minute. But where do we go from here? First, I should ask a question of you. How many people here are involved in philanthropy? You work for foundations, and how many are land conservation practitioners? How many of you are involved in social services of any sort? Not very many. Okay, this seems government. Okay, government. There you go. So one of the things we learned, Gina and I learned, and I've also learned through conversations with lots of people working in the field in conservation, is that there's something emerging that I will call community-based conservation. And this concept differs from where we've been before in that it looks much more broadly at the value of land as it contributes to communities and the livability of those communities. So I'm sort of thrown up a working definition that others will probably do better at drafting, but it's conservation that contributes to the prosperity, the vibrancy, the livability of our communities. We're looking at land as a platform for making the places that we value more livable, more prosperous. And that changes the way we do land conservation, and it certainly changes the way we consider funding land conservation, and we're starting to see some signs of that. I want to just try to give you a little bit more of a flavor for what is happening and what I think defines this concept of community-based conservation a little bit more. Community-based conservation is about providing recreational opportunities close to home, where people live. It's also about public health, about obesity and child inactivity. It's about access to local food and food security. It's about incorporating arts and entertainment in outdoor spaces in our cities. It's really about the silos coming down that have traditionally divided conservation from public health, arts, education, hunger, housing, food production, and economic development. It's people from all of those sectors working together to not just protect land, but to provide places that allow us individually and collectively to live richer, fuller lives. And I think this trend is emerging for both strategic as well as moral reasons. It's good business, and it's the right thing to do. And I say that because if you think about it, we've all sort of had this idea, or at least I have had this idea in mind, that our goal is to protect land through conservation easements, whether donated or purchased, or acquisition of land, and to then set it aside, put a legal boundary around it, and say we've protected it. This will never go away now because we've put boundaries around it. But the reality is that as a society, we make lots of decisions every day. And if people don't value what we've set aside, what a lot of us have spent our lives work doing, what's to say that 10, 50, 100 years from now, if people don't understand why this is relevant to their lives, that it will continue to be protected? These barriers, these walls we've put up with legal mechanisms are not that strong, frankly. We know that government can take land when it wishes. And so one of the biggest fears I have is that if we don't engage more people in our work and understanding the relevance, the importance day to day to their lives, that all this good work we've done and all the important work we've done and all the value that we derive as a society and as humans from this land may be in jeopardy. I also think there are some big changes that have taken place in recent years that are challenges to conservation. They also provide some opportunities. So I think it's no surprise that most of us believe we're going to have to do more with less. And there's just a lot less around, particularly a lot less money, and particularly for our government friends, a lot less government money. And government money has been very important to land conservation, as most of you know. And we know that conservation is very expensive. There are a few endeavors that are more expensive than acquiring land. Some of the deals in Maine, some of the larger deals in Maine have been 10, 20, 30, $50 million. How long can that go on in this current fiscal environment? We know the public is demanding more accountability for the public monies that are being used for all things, but certainly for conservation as well. I've also learned in the last few years that funders really like the synergy and multiple benefits when they make a grant. What I mean by that is there are a lot of foundations, mine is one of them, in which we're funding animal welfare, we're funding the environment and conservation. We're also funding a whole host of social service programs. If I can make one grant that provides benefit across those sectors in some way, that's a winner. It's certainly a winner for our board. And foundations often they do work in multiple sectors, and they'd like to see their funds go further and looking for these synergies across sectors. I think the other thing we do know is that land is an important important economic asset, and its sustainable use actually may provide a model for a new economic reality, and that's particularly true in rural areas. Now, there was a great story from Vermont. Who's a person from Vermont? You're from Vermont, right? So I was at a conference in Vermont, and they were talking about a public hearing around a land conservation deal. No, it was a industrial plant that was going to move into a rural agricultural area, and somebody stood up at the meeting and said they were opposed to the idea of protecting the land and zoning out this industrial facility because they said what we need is a plant, an industrial plant, that will put food on people's tables. Okay? So let's get rid of the agricultural land because that's not going to feed anybody. We're instead going to have a factory here. Well, clearly that has been the model in the past. It's certainly been the model in northern Maine, but the mills are gone and they're not coming back. So the idea that we're going to have some magic bullet come to our rural communities in northern New England and save the day with jobs that are paying $25 an hour, those days are over. And what we have, though, is an asset base in the land that actually could become the new economic driver for that region, and one that is sustainable and long-lasting and won't change with the whim of some decision maker in some distant land. The other thing I think that's happening is it seems to me that the world has become a bigger, scarier place. There are things flying apart all over the world. Every day we read the headlines and something horrible is happening somewhere. I don't know what it is, but it seems that there's a psychology. You know, there was a book or a publication years ago by Robert Putnam here at Harvard called Bowling Alone. And it talked about the loss of community and what was happening. Everybody was sort of spinning out and there was no social capital because people weren't working together anymore. I think that's changing. And I think it may be changing in part because people are frightened about the big scary world and they're looking to their community for refuge. And I see more and more activity at the local level where people are pulling together to protect their community. And land is a key component of that. But that's not all they want. They want their communities to be the kind of place that maybe they knew from their childhood, where their children can be raised with a lot of different things that make a community livable. So I want to turn now to a couple of examples of how this is happening. And I started out thinking that I could get a bunch of really good examples from all over the Northeast. And there are many examples from all across the Northeast. But I decided to default back to what I know. I think when you're an author, you're told you should write something you know something about. So I'm going to default back to something I know. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 projects underway in Maine that I'm familiar with that might help set the stage for this a little bit. And I want to go down to far Downeast Maine. This is called the Downeast Lakes region of Maine. It's in Washington County near the New Brunswick border. It's an area of extensive waterfront, lake frontage, and working forest. It's the primary asset in that area. And about 5 years ago, 22,000 acres, I'm going to show you a little map here. 22,000 acres of land came up for sale. It's the red project area on the map there. And this property came up for sale. The landowners wanted to move it fairly quickly. What was interesting about it is that if you see all the green, the light green, the brown, and the dark green, those were all lands that had already been conserved over time. About 1.4 million acres of land over time between Crown lands in New Brunswick and then timberlands and other properties that have been conserved in Downeast Maine. And then the Browne properties, both sides, which are owned by the Passamaquoddy tribe. This was the hole in the donut that would link everything together. There is a local land trust in the area, Downeast Lakes Land Trust, which has precisely 2 people working for it. The town has a little fewer than 100 year-round residents. And they were driving a project that, when they learned the price tag of $24 million, said, I guess we have to do this. How they were going to do that was a big question. But they framed this as they have some other projects, not strictly as a conservation project, but as a community project. This project was going to have aspects to it. The way the land would be used and its importance to the local economy was at the center of this project. And so they formed a broad coalition. And there were a number of things they were interested in. This property has extensive wetlands. Ecologically, it's very, very important. And not only are the wetlands important, but because of the linkages, the wildlife corridors that would be established by it. So it had an ecological component. You can tell where it isn't wet, it's forest for the most part. And this is land that has been for over 100 years heavily timbered. Not always sustainably, I might add. But that was a key piece. They wanted to make sure that this property would continue to be managed. The vast majority of the acreage would continue to be managed for commercial timberland. Recreational access. I should put all of these in. This property has 17 miles of shore frontage. This happens to also be an area that is world-renowned for its fishing opportunities. It has the best landlocked salmon fishery in the state of Maine and therefore in the Northeast, at least in the United States. It's a place where people have come to hunt, fish, camp, and be out in the wild for generations. So protection of this land was really a key component to the survival of the community. Another interesting piece of this, though, was that there were 3 parcels that were identified early on that could be set aside for future growth in the community. The community was concerned, where will there be additional housing in the future if all of this land is set aside? And so there were 2 lots that were set aside for that purpose, and a third out on the access road into town that was set aside for light industry in hopes that perhaps down the road there could be some businesses and entrepreneurs that would move in and have a place to actually go. And so a partnership was created. The first thing that the Land Trust did is it reached out to Lime Timber Company. Mary is here today. Lime Timber, those of you who don't know it, is a timber land investment organization. It also has consulting services to foundations and nonprofits. But one of the things that they've been able to do successfully is acquire land and then work out transactions in which conservation becomes a key component of the project and a key financial component of the project. So the sale of conservation easements and ultimately the sale of land is part of the return model that Lime Timber has built in. And as a friendly buyer, if you will, they were able to get this land and secure it quickly, and then work with the Land Trust and the community to stage their takeout so that there could be components of the fundraising done in manageable chunks and portions of the property protected over time. The first 2 pieces of it being 2 conservation easements, one which is just about to close, I think any day now, on easement on the wetland that I mentioned to you. So they had a friendly buyer investor. The town became a key partner early on, and at town meeting there was a warrant put on the town warrant had a article to appropriate monies for the acquisition of this property, and the town voted unanimously, I think, or near unanimously, to dedicate $40,000 to this. Now, $40,000 out of $24 million isn't going to go a long way, but I don't know of any other town that's appropriated that much money for a land conservation project in Maine. Business community was fully behind it. One of the biggest businesses is guiding and woodsworking. All of those business, and there were several merchants. They were all very much in support of it. The Passamaquoddy tribe was very supportive. This is the heart of a lot of their cultural history, and they were concerned to see the property developed primarily for house lots. What was also interesting about this is, I don't know how many of you follow or followed at all Maine politics in the last year. We had an election last November, and a governor was elected who derives from the Tea Party. He's very supportive of this project, one of the few that he's supportive of in conservation, and we have complete bipartisan support in Congress for this project. And again, it goes back to the fact that it is seen as key to the economic as well as the cultural and social fabric of the community. So I just want to mention one other thing that goes to the funding side of this. To pull this project off, Lime Timber made it very clear early on that they needed to have some skin in the game from those who were going to raise the money to know that this was a serious project. So they required a $2 million option payment at the outset. That meant that the community, the Land Trust and others in the community had to come up with $2 million very quickly. What happened in the funding world was pretty interesting. 4 major foundations came together and worked out a way that they could help with most of the funding very quickly. The R.K. Mellon Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Sewell Foundation, and there was one other. I'm going to forget it. Mary, help me out here. Open Space Institute, which is in New York, but they do a re-grant program for the Duke Foundation. So three national organizations and one statewide foundation came together and were able to put up all but about $300,000, which was raised locally to secure this property. And after that, there's been a lot more fundraising, and as well as a lot of government funding that has gone into this. You may not recognize this project when I describe it as a conservation project at all. You're looking at a picture of a grist mill. It's a machine that came from Austria that is a fairly newfangled machine to mill grain, primarily wheat. And I'm going to take you now away from Downeast Maine to western Maine, west central Maine, to the town of Skowhegan. Skowhegan is a town that once had it and no longer does. It was sort of the crossroads between southern Maine and northern Maine, so crossroads between the agricultural heartland of central Maine and the great North Woods and the timber resources of that area. And it was a very prosperous town up till about the turn of the century, when a lot of log driving down the Kennebec River, which it is on, was taking place, and there was a lot of milling activity as a result of the agricultural lands nearby. In fact, historically, apparently, this was one of the top wheat producers and bread producers for the Union troops during the Civil War. A rich history in agriculture. Today, 51% of the residents of this community, and I think of the county, children are on reduced or free lunch program. Highly impoverished area. And with little hope, frankly, until recently. And what's happened recently is the woman on the left is a woman named Amber Lamke. She grew up in Brunswick, Maine, moved to Skowhegan, has a PhD in something unrelated at all to conservation or food or anything else. But she had a brainstorm. She had become sort of a amateur bread baker, and was, as you know, artisan breads have made a comeback. She, with a number of other people, started having a conference they called a kneading conference, where people would come and learn about new techniques in bread, new old techniques, if you will, in bread making. And that conference started to attract people from all over the region and all over the country. Today, I think last year they had over 1,500 people from all over the country come to Skowhegan to learn about baking bread. At the same time, there were some local farmers, mostly young people, who were recognizing that, gee, you know, it'd be wonderful if we had a farmer's market in Skowhegan. So they, about 15 years ago, started a farmer's market. So there's this little bit of activity going around food. And Amber decided what they needed to do is establish a food hub, with Skowhegan as the center of that food hub. And they would start to attract, in her mind, lots of different people engaged in local foods, the local food movement. And so the county jail came up for sale, okay? Right in the heart of town, right in the downtown, in a sort of a blighted area. And she and her husband, who's a doctor, a family practice doctor in town, bought it very inexpensively. This thing has 3-foot concrete walls, and 3-foot concrete floors and whatnot. And she said, you know, what we could do with this building is we could build a grist mill. And so that is precisely what they're doing right now. They have bought the building. It's a fairly large building. The center of it will be a grist mill. They'll bring the grain in from the top, do the threshing on the third level. The milling will take place on the second level, and then it'll be shipped out on the first level. And this machine is what they bought to do that. And they've put holes all the way through, so the whole thing. But in the meantime, they've also leased out a lot of the exterior part of the building to small entrepreneurial ventures. There's a woman who's a potter. There's a woman who's built a community kitchen. And what's interesting about this also is that the parking lot of the old jail has been the location for the farmers market. So now they've got the farmers market, they're going to have the mill, they're going to have a community kitchen where people can come in and learn how to make, how many of you know how to cook kale, right? There are a few of you that know how to do that. I have a great recipe for it, by the way, but so teaching people. But what's also interesting is that her husband, who's a doctor, very concerned about nutrition and health. And there's a foundation in Connecticut called Wholesome Wave. Have any of you heard of Wholesome Wave? Okay. Wholesome Wave, I think primarily comes from Paul Newman money originally, but they're making grants to provide vouchers for primarily low-income people to be able to buy nutritious, local, fresh food. And what they have done is they've made a grant to the Economic Development Corporation in Skowhegan to provide these vouchers to her husband, basically, in his medical practice. And they've identified pregnant women as the primary client. So if you are a pregnant woman and you come in for a check, you come in for anything, you get a double your money voucher to use at the farmer's market. And the result of that is that they're seeing a really big increase in the number of people going to the farmer's market. They're also seeing a changed pattern in the nutrition standards and nutritional choices that pregnant women are making. And their theory is that if you're going to change behavior, the most likely time and the most likely candidate is a pregnant woman, particularly first time. So what's this got to do with conservation? What it has to do with conservation is she needs 600 tons of grain annually to make this work. And she needs farm fields and abandoned farms and farms that are being growing other things to start growing grain. And that's happening. There are farmers who are very interested in this because it's going to be higher, it's going to be value-added food, value-added product for them. They can make a lot more money selling wheat that will be value-added in bread than they can silage corn, which is primarily what they're growing now. And so a lot of the younger, particularly the younger farmers, are converting. And as a result of that, she's going to go into production next year. And but another piece of this, and there are sort of two conservation pieces. One is that there's going to be a lot more land in productive farming when this goes online. And the hope is that this will actually just be the start, and there will be a lot more land that goes into production as the local food movement continues to grow in this area and beyond. But also, the Maine Farmland Trust is finding a demand for farmers coming and looking for land to grow. And they have a buy, restrict, sell program where they will buy farms, restrict them with conservation easements to bring the value down, and then find farmers, match that with farmers who can't afford to pay full value, full development value. The Sewell Foundation last year decided that we would make a major commitment to this effort in order to try to help get it going. But we weren't the only ones. Harvard Pilgrim has made an investment here. So, gee, I never thought that I'd see a public health care or healthcare provider interested in something that has nothing to do with conservation as far as I was concerned, now teaming up with conservation funders to help bring back a community and all of the interrelated things that happen as a result of that. I'm just going to mention one other thing that I found kind of interesting. Right after my time at Maine Coast Heritage Trust, a very supportive donor was asked by Maine Coast Heritage Trust if she would make a large grant for a land conservation project. And she said, we've done a lot of land conservation grant making in the past. I don't want to do that anymore. It's like, well, why not? Because I think you all need to spend more time thinking about community. Okay? Well, Maine Coast Heritage Trust had, in its most recent strategic plan, come up with one strategic objective, which was called MCHT in the community, engaging community. And she challenged the organization to actually put that in practice. And what she said is, I'll make a grant, and it was a $250,000 grant to you, but you may not use it in direct land conservation. You've got to do something else that's beneficial to community as a result of that. And so that was a big challenge for MCHT because they weren't exactly sure what she wanted, what they were going to do with it. But since then, they've made about 20 seed grants with this money. And so some examples. The town of Cutler, Maine, down east, needed $15,000 to renovate their town landing and the boat launch for the local fishermen. Maine Coast Heritage Trust put some money into that. That same town needed, its clam flats needed reseeding. They helped with that. Another town nearby, there was a need for emergency responder equipment. MCHT helped pay for the emergency response equipment, knowing that if there was an accident on one of the vast holdings that MCHT has down there, the town was going to be called to respond. And so it only seemed appropriate that there also be a contribution to that kind of activity within the community. This is a bit of a challenge, I know, for Maine Coast Heritage Trust. How are they going to decide when it's appropriate to make a grant to a community for something of interest to them? And how does it tie to their objectives in conservation? But by having that conversation, the town of Lubec, where they made the grant for emergency response equipment, that was a very hostile town to Maine Coast Heritage Trust. There's a lot of land that was owned there, and it was a town that just didn't get it. Why do we want you here from away, taking land off the tax rolls, providing no benefit to us? We don't need more land. That land was there before, it'll be there when you're gone, and we just don't care. Well, another program they've seeded is a education program for local kids. There are lots of kids now going out and doing nature studies on these properties. They're the ones that come back to their parents and say, you know, I had a really cool day. I learned something on this land. This is one of the farmers, one of the grain farmers, who also runs the farmers market. And they've got a children's garden going now, trying to get the kids involved. This is not the old jail, but it's right next door. What's required to do this work? And particularly I want to talk about funders. What do funders need to be thinking about? They need to look beyond what we call acres and bucks in conservation, meaning that land conservation is all about protecting acres and raising money to do that. This is a much bigger job and a more indirect job now than it used to be. It's not just about saving land. It's about something much larger. Fewer, bigger, longer. There's a wonderful fellow in Boston who runs something called Bridge Span. Some of you may have heard of him, Tom Tierney. He's written a book called Give Smart, and he coined this fewer, bigger, longer. To do community conservation work, you can't spread yourself too thin. These projects take a long time, they require a major investment, and you can only do a few of them at a time. So as a funder, there's a tendency to want to spread the wealth and do small grants and distribute it and feel good about that. But to do this work well, you really have to be focused, and you have to stay there a long time. And you have to invest in capacity. I know as a funder, there's always pressure to sort of look at the budget and say, budget of your grant seeker, and say, you know, you got a big overhead figure in here. You know, we don't like overhead. Nobody likes overhead, right? That just seems like a waste of money. But you know what? You can't do work without overhead. That's what makes the organization run. And yes, you could say too much overhead's too much, but organizations that do this work, a lot of land trusts don't have the capacity to do this work right now. This is not something they know a lot about. And it takes time, and you've got to be out there. There's a lot of community organizing and listening. And so you've got to invest in that, or it's not going to happen. Most of these projects, certainly the Downeast Lakes Land Trust project, required a lot of public funding. These are expensive projects if they're landscape scale. And over time, generally, there needs to be some public funding. A lot of foundations are very leery of advocacy, but certainly advocating and helping organizations go out and work either in communities with bond issues or statewide bond issues for land conservation. That's going to be necessary, especially in the future as there's fewer and fewer dollars and more people are competing for them. I mean, collaborate, it's pretty self-evident. You've got to reach out to non-traditional partners and stakeholders that have been not included in conservation. And that generally means, the next bullet, that the land conservation community will find itself more frequently in a facilitator role and not the project driving role. Most of us who've been in conservation, we've got all the answers pretty well figured out, right? We know what we need to protect. We know how we need to protect it. We've just got to raise the money, align the stars, and it'll be done. Not so in community conservation. If you don't bring your partners in, if you're not allowing them to determine what it is that they'd like to see protected and how they'd like to have it used, and to be more collaborative in that decision-making process and the planning process, it's going to fail. And then, as I mentioned in the example with the Downeast Lakes project, aligning and pooling funding are very important. Nobody's got enough. Just, in the same way that you can't pull off a community project by working independently, funders are not going to be able to work independently and have the resources necessary to actually pull off a project like this. So having Richard King Mellon and Duke and Sewell and others working together, if they're not pooling their funding, at least aligning and working together for the common good is essential. So I'm going to end it there, if that's okay, since I have nothing more to say. And then answer any questions if we have time for that.
Have a little interaction. Going back to the Downeast Lakes project, did the Land Use Regulatory Commission or the town zoning have anything to do with how that project shaped up? And what is the role of government on that side in this new era?
Yeah, that's a good question. In this case, not really, because this is a transaction still with regard to conservation easement. They don't really regulate that. They would regulate development. So if there was a proposal for developing this land, the Land Use Regulation Commission, for those of you who don't know, Maine, well, I know this fella knows all about it right in the front row here, or third row. The Land Use Regulation Commission is in effect the planning board for the unorganized territories of Maine, which is about 60% of the landmass of Maine. So they would have jurisdiction over any development proposal in that area. The only case in which they might have gotten involved, and I don't think they did because it is a township, would have been the development of the lots, the outlots that I mentioned.
But there wasn't an alternative development proposal on the table. This wasn't in the face of the development proposal.
No, this was not. Unlike, for instance, those of you who may be familiar with the Plum Creek project in the Greenville area. No, there was not a proposal put in advance. Mary, I don't think there was not a. Yeah, so this was not in reaction to a development proposal. No.
I'm Lee Youngblood. I'm the executive director of Mount Grace. And my question is about the Skowhegan project. That was really wonderful. Mount Grace is entering into doing more farm projects, but my specific question is, with the Maine Farmland Trust, their buy, restrict, sell program, does it include any permanent affordability? Because the farm is affordable to the first farmer, but what happens then?
What happens after that? Yeah. I got to tell you, I'm not terribly well versed in that, but I do believe in certain instances there are provisions that would provide for, if you couldn't just flip it. But the mechanism for that, I'm afraid I don't know.
It has to be resold at its agricultural value, mostly, is how they structure those.
Well, there's the piece of having an easement on it already, which would keep the value relative to full value down, just by virtue of a permanent easement. The question I think you're getting at, though, is even land that is under easement will continue to rise in value, and it could get beyond the capability of farmers. So,
At agricultural value, like that exists in Massachusetts for the land, what we don't have in Massachusetts is an option at ag value. This is on subsequent sales. We don't have an option at ag value for the farmhouse and the building. So that's why I was kind of interested in this whole farm affordability. And my interest is really more than just the Maine Farmland Trust, but that was your example. And I wonder, in doing your research, if you ran across this permanent affordability issue.
you know where I've run across it is not in this, but in with Habitat for Humanity. They have a really interesting model for keeping their houses affordable. And don't make me go through the mechanics of it because I'll get it all wrong. But
no, that's okay. I think there's a great opportunity for merging Habitat for Humanity, community land trust, and farm, especially farm conservation work.
yeah.
And there are other affordable housing models that key into that.
There was a at Maine Coast Heritage Trust, we did a project in Cutler we set aside 50 acres, and there's actually an affordable housing organization that was established to determine how that land would be used, how it would remain affordable. We were out of the project by that point. We just set the land aside for that purpose.
Let me just mention, we do at the Lincoln Institute work with community land trusts and their whole learning network, and you'll find some information about that on our website and on the CLT network website as well. Yes, right here.
I'm Lee Carlton. I'm a grad student at the Muskie School.
Oh.
So I love to hear about Maine. I grew up in Maine, so it was great to hear some examples. Can you speak to the proposal for the Great North Woods to create a national forest or a national park?
Oh, boy.
Everybody from Maine, please leave the room. I might get lynched. Yeah, it's an interesting proposal. What's interesting, there's a proposal that has been floating for quite a while for the establishment of a national park, really in central Maine, or sort of the middle of Maine, near Baxter State Park in that area. It has been criticized roundly, locally, politically, but a woman named Roxanne Quimby, who is the former Burt's Bees owner, has started that conversation again, largely by going into the community of Millinocket and saying, I own 70,000 acres here now. I would like to give this to the National Park Service to establish a national park. And I think it's my right as a private landowner. I'm willing to listen, but she believes that it could be an economic driver for the region. And I think there's a dialogue now that's starting that is different than it was. And Bob, you can speak to this better than I can. I'm sure you've been hounded by it. We have a state senator in the audience here, but so I'm not sure I want to comment personally on what I think. I think it definitely needs to be looked at, and conversation around it is happening. We'll see where it comes out. How about that for a political answer?
Can you maybe speak to some of the land trust and conservation groups, how they might be able to work within that project and support it or not support, their role in the effort?
Yeah, good question. Well, one of the things that has to happen is there has to be first of all, a study done to determine whether it's feasible to do it. And then the next step would be if there is public support, because it'll have to come from the region. The Congress is not going to act, and Congress would have to act to allow it to happen and then appropriate funds for it to happen. I think land trusts could do a number of things. They could certainly advocate for it or not. They could start acquiring additional lands that might be added to the park over time, because there is 70,000 acres. That's twice Acadia National Park, a little bit more than twice Acadia National Park. But so it's a long road. I know 2016 is the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, and there's a lot of hope that that could happen by then on the part of Roxanne. I think that'd be optimistic. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but.
You had mentioned the one community expressed concern about having land removed from their tax rolls. And I think in order to overcome that, you have to be able to demonstrate that it will be an economic driver.
Correct.
And that municipal funds will be recovered elsewhere. How can you make that case? I mean, how do you make that case?
It's absolutely a huge question right now. And a lot of people are asking that question. How can you demonstrate that in the long run, this will actually be an economic driver? I mean, Andy Fallender, who was behind you, has probably done more of that on the ground than anybody in this room. Andy, do you have any sense of that? Can you demonstrate that at AMC?
Well, I'm too sidetracked first by the previous comment. If I can comment on that, then I'll move on to this one.
You want to come up here?
I think that the question about the Maine Woods National Park is just so totally relevant to what you've been saying this afternoon, because being able to advocate for that, if you thought you were really committed to it, could totally disrupt your relationships with the local community. So the unfortunate part about the whole project is that it does have this impediment and this emotionalism to it. So just speaking for ourselves, and I think the same for a lot of our colleagues, you wouldn't want to touch it. Is that tactful enough?
Yeah, it's right on, yeah.
For us, we found the biggest challenge is to get rationality onto the scene. Where you lose is in the bars. It's I'm really serious, you know, it's the gossip for those of us who aren't in Greenville every evening talking, and you hear about the terrible things that this, that, or the other organization's doing. You have trouble countering that. What you can do is try to be as proactive as possible with the facts. And what we've tried to do, for example, is to do just real simple economic impact studies, not ones that have big flow charts, but ones that have very simple PowerPoint, like Jane did such a good job of demonstrating today, and show how the number of individuals who you're attracting to town based on the survey you've done, the amount that they're spending in the local restaurant, in the motels, in the gift shops, and the impact that has. Well, when we've done that, for example, in Greenville, to the town select people, they've just been amazed. But then you come back 6 months later and they've forgotten. You talk to the guy who runs the local snowmobile association, and he most certainly hasn't heard about that. So it really requires just this never-ending, proactive work in these communities to get the word across and to reinforce it. The numbers are there. You just have to be rational and market them.
And I'd add to that, I'm Allison Clarkson, I'm a state legislator in Vermont, I'm a state representative, working very closely on current use issues, which is our use value tax. And so actually the land is not taken off the tax rolls. The municipal portion of the tax is actually reimbursed by the state for all conserved land. And it is the education portion of the property tax that we then share statewide when we take on land that is in the current use program, in our use value appraisal program.
And I should have mentioned, we pay full property taxes on the 70,000 acres we own, and it works so well when you have sustainable harvesting as a piece of the puzzle, because that helps pay your taxes.
And one other thing I just add to that is change is hard. A lot of these rural communities, particularly in Maine, they've been driven by mills, and those mills are gone. And so there's always that kind of thing in the back of the mind, well, the mill jobs are coming back, but they're not. So we don't think they are anyway. So how do you kind of get people to think, well, what do we do next? What are the economic opportunities? And not sort of fight the loss, just embrace the new. That's a hard thing to do for all of us.
I do think the mills will come back. I think you're wrong on that. But I think when those mills come back, they're going to be highly automated. And a mill that used to maybe employ 300 people might be able to function with 30 people and produce even more lumber. And so I don't think you're correct in saying that the mills won't come back, but they are not going to come back with the number of employees. And if these people want to stay up in that neck of the woods, they have to have other things. And I think, going back to some of the comments, I mean, like in Downeast, they have this huge sculpture program, which is very interesting. I mean, it's not conservation, but what happens is they're putting these sculptures, big granite sculptures that are done in these symposiums every 2 years in all of the communities up along the coast. And there are a huge number of people who want to go see those sculptures. And so there's a route you take, and it takes you all the way down to Cutler. In fact, I think there is a sculpture in Cutler. And people begin to understand the impact of this because they see people coming down with foreign license plates, I mean, in the United States, not foreign license plates, and they see these things, and it begins to have an impact because they do have to eat there, they do have to spend the night, and it does form a form of employment. Now, that's just a statement I want to make. But the other question I have, Jay, is, okay, with Maine Coast, they're given that grant to make these community-oriented things, okay? Now, that's $250,000. That's somewhat of a unique grant. The question I have is, okay, you're seeing the clam beds, let's say, in Cutler. And the clam beds, let's say, have died out, and this is obviously going to have an economic impact. Shouldn't there be a return to the conservation, well, to Maine Coast, not necessarily, but let's say, I don't know, let's say for 10 cents for every peck, they get that money back, because how are you going to sustain this? And I do think it's very important, but let's say no other foundations want to give it to you. How do you make this into a revolving fund instead of just a dying out fund?
Let me answer that this way, but first I want to thank you for pointing out that you're right. That in fact, the amount of timber being harvested in Maine really hasn't changed. In fact, it may even be up slightly. But the number of jobs are way, way down, and that's what's going to stay. So, but with respect to what you're just saying, let me give you a better example of where that might come into play. In Trescott, Maine, which is right near Cutler and Lubec, Maine Coast Heritage Trust acquired a property that has 80 acres of blueberries. Mm-hmm. They've been working to try to convert those to organic blueberries and leasing those lands for continued blueberrying. They will actually get revenue from that. And they're also looking at ways that they can help a group of blueberry growers in the area come together and possibly even start investing in value-added processing. So getting involved directly in the production of food is something that land trusts are looking at, and other kinds of social ventures, if you will, that may not pay, their full freight early on. Maybe they will down the road, but certainly would help subsidize what otherwise would just be strictly, raise the money and send it out.
Jay, my name's Keith Ross, and I've been working with, as a consultant to New England Forestry Foundation, working with small land trusts around New England to aggregate, projects together. We've got about more than 80 land trusts who are trying to find ways to reduce the cost of individual transactions, increase the pace of conservation, and by combining talents and abilities, and getting low cost for bulk services. We've had a lot of success actually with public dollars, but very little success with private philanthropy. And it's just because your statement right at the beginning that one land trust, one land trust. And we have twice gotten gotten foundations together to talk about this. They really like the program. We talk about how to get together afterward, and then nothing ever happens. Your list of what's required, I thought, was really good. And my question is, how do you implement that? How do you get private philanthropy organizations to develop a process where they do talk to each other regularly, where they actually implement these things by collaborating?
Well, I think that happens in a number of different ways, and I'm not sure. I don't know much about the foundation world outside of Maine because the Sewell Foundation only works in Maine, with some very rare exceptions. So in Maine, through the Maine Philanthropy Center, there are a lot of conversations starting to happen about collaborative work among foundations. Foundations are the first to say, "Oh, you all have to work collaboratively. You need to all work together. There's so many nonprofits, we can't fund them all. Blah blah blah." But then they don't do it themselves. So, but that's changing, I think, Keith, and that's going to take some leadership on the part of people who want to do that kind of work and get people together.
Does Sewell Foundation have a program to start that leadership?
We don't have a program per se, but we've been participating in lots of different forums. There's an affinity group around conservation called the Environmental Funders Network, and I serve on the steering committee of that. There's a healthcare group that's gotten together, and now there's a healthcare and environment group that's starting to work together. So, I don't have much history in the funding world, so I don't really know what was happening before, but I'm told there wasn't much happening in that realm before. But it seems to be occurring more and more, and I think it's largely the same reason for why land trusts are working, say, in the mid-coast of Maine in a collaborative way using your model, the one that you invented, to say, we could do our little service region, or we can look at this landscape in a much broader way and work together and pool our resources and get a lot more done over time. And I think that's starting to happen, Keith.
Like you say, all it needs is leadership from a foundation within a state that could do that. Maybe someone who has a background in land conservation.
Krista Collins, I'm the director of Land Protection for Sunbury Valley Trustees. And I'm hearing what you say about the fact that most land trusts don't have capacity to sort of broaden our scope, and maybe our boards might accuse us of mission drift as we start taking on public health and agriculture projects. We were lucky to have an AmeriCorps volunteer last year who served as an outreach coordinator and was able to do a community garden project in South Framingham, we do a lot of work in Northwest Framingham, which is relatively rural, but it was an amazing opportunity to sort of reach an audience that we hadn't reached before and to kind of get our name out there in a different way. But that AmeriCorps volunteer has moved on. We don't have staff capacity to do stuff like that. Our board recognizes the importance of local agriculture. From a funder's perspective, are we better off sort of as we go through our next round of strategic planning, looking to expand our capacity in that respect, or noting the importance of collaboration? Should we be seeking out those groups who are already maybe doing that work? And I feel like there's so many in Massachusetts I wouldn't even know where to start. What's the approach?
That's a really good question because, I know, again, talking about what I know something about. At Maine Coast Heritage Trust, they were given in 1999 a 137-acre saltwater farm that had belted galloways on it in the Camden Rockport area. And, everybody was going, what are we doing? Let's get rid of the cows, Like, no, wait a minute. Don't get rid of the cows. Keep all the parts together until we figure out what we're going to do. So, 10 or so years later, the local food movement starts to explode. And there's incredible programming going on there now. We're getting all kinds, it's just like this iconic landscape to begin with. And now it's put MCHT at the heart of the community. However, how many places can MCHT do that? And so there's some on staff saying, well, we need to control everything, right? So we want to do an Aldermere Farm kind of a project in Freeport, and we want to do one down east, and we want to do, and others are saying, well, wait a minute. Let's find who the partners are. Let's talk to Amber in Skowhegan before we go and set up our own program. I know trustees of reservations. They've transformed themselves into something else than when I first started in conservation, working very much in community. There are groups doing, lots to gardens all over New England. And how could you team up with them? I don't know, but I'd be careful before you try to do it all yourself. And you are going to be accused of mission drift. There's no doubt about it. You're going to have to work through that one. That won't be easy.
I work here. I work at the Harvard Forest, and I also am associated with some projects with the University of Maine in Downeast Maine that Jay knows about. So my question is, in trying to build this long-term community consensus about community-based conservation, you've talked about the public sector and the private sector and the nonprofit sector and getting everyone to work together. You just haven't, in this particular presentation, talked about the role that educational and research institutions can play in helping to build that consensus. And I know, actually from other conversations we've had, that Sewell is helping to sponsor this Downeast Research Network and other things that draw educational and research institutions into the dialogue. And I wondered if you could expand on that.
Well, you mentioned that one. This is a group of, really driven originally by the local land trust down there, one of the local land trusts. But how could there be, there's a vision to, in effect, look at Downeast Maine as potentially something like a research triangle park, if you will, if you're familiar with that concept in North Carolina, where you might have academic, conservation, research facilities all working together, using the landscape, and this in that case, a really pretty intact, rich ecological landscape as a place where, as a platform for innovative research of all kinds of sorts that might spin off products that are natural resource based, what have you. It's still very much kind of a thought. You know, that, like so many other things, it depends on who's got vision and who's got leadership and who's got the energy to kind of keep it going. You have to have that at the core, and then making sure you've got the right people at the table. So we were at a meeting back sometime in May. Was it May? It was, yeah. In which, you know, some of the players that are necessary to make that work were at the table. They had the University of Maine at Machias and the GIS, the Geographic Information System people, people from College of the Atlantic, somebody from the University of Maine at Orono, and the new CERC facility down at Acadia. They didn't have a lot of people in the social services programs that are doing, you know, work on the Passamaquoddy tribe and elsewhere on drug and alcohol abuse issues, which are part of this, actually. You know, that's ground zero for OxyContin misuse and abuse. So, you know, I don't know where that's going. I think it's really, there are a lot of smart people who could provide the kind of information, the kind of data that Andy, you know, as he's trying to convince communities, actually this does provide economic benefit to the community, or the Muskie Institute, you know, or Lincoln Institute. There's a need for data out there, and I think hopefully that, you know, we'll figure out how to do that.
Once land is conserved in Vermont, it's interesting, it actually escalates in value. It becomes of more interest to a whole lot of people, particularly people who aren't full-time residents. And one of our challenges has been, how do we educate listers and assessors about conserved land so that we don't escalate the value, because that will truly make it, I mean, we can do work on the houses, that's easier than on the land. And the land does escalate in value, and that is a real problem. And I'm just interested if you've done any work on, it doesn't sound like you've done a lot of work on the financial sustainability of land.
Well, we've done some work on the effect of conservation on land values.
Yeah, but it goes to sort of education, your point, Jim, about, I mean, what are we doing about educating listers, assessors around the country about
What
conservation?
makes you think that they shouldn't assess it at the full value?
But they do. And they add value to it because of its conserved, you know, for many people that has added value.
Well, on this one, I'd say, you know, we work on the technical side of this in terms of both analysis and training of assessors and appraisers through our tax program at the Institute. And I think you want to get it right. You know, you want to reflect the reduction in value which an easement imposes, but also the changes over time. And that's, you know, that's our obligation to other taxpayers, that, you know, the game is fair. So I think this is a matter of training as much as anything, and we do a fair amount of that to be sure that assessors and appraisers understand the sort of the principles and the methods that would lead to, you know, consistent results. And I think it's transparency, a sort of fairness in the application of the rules, ability to sort of go and see is it being done properly. These are all components of, you know, I think an effective tax program. And so I think that the need is real, and we've seen over time that even understanding that easements can reduce value of land, because that's, you know, what they should do, is not universally understood.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say that we partner, I've served on the Adirondack Council Board and on the Vermont Natural Resources Council Board, and I serve on Ways and Means in Vermont, and partnership is the key to everything now. Just everything. Nothing is done without partnerships. We've just preserved 30 miles of trails in the center of Woodstock. I represent Woodstock and Reading. In a fabulous partnership with Health, Chamber of Commerce, who are now marketing it as a walking destination town. So I mean, it's just in the National Park, the Chamber, the Health Center, the legislature and private donors. It's just been an amazing partnership to make, to unify that trail system. So your key partner.
Jump in. I think we have time for one more thing. Mary, yeah.
One more thing I might say about the issue you raised earliest, and that is, there's this argument about land going up in value, and you conserve it and it's going to go up in value. I have some question about how that may or may not happen in reality. But what I think is important for us to keep in mind is that if we can find ways in which land continues to be used in a sustainable, ecologically compatible, productive way, whether it's through this growing local food movement where we're seeing some real activity and some real economic activity, or community forests are starting to grow significantly in New England. And the model there is for timber to be managed sustainably, to be harvested, and for the benefits to flow back to the community. And so then you kind of get out of this place where we've all been, where it's kind of us, them. We're working together for the benefit of the community and the prosperity of the community. And so in my mind, I'm more focused in that than I am on the old arguments.
Jay, thank you for this discussion. I think it's really exciting, important, and timely for the world that we live in. My question is this: if you go back to one of your former hats, which is the director or chair board of the Alliance, and you know a great deal about the land conservation movement in general. So from a 60,000-foot perspective, the 1,600 land trusts that are across the U.S., what are your insights and thoughts on moving those entities? And obviously not all of them can, will, or should make this migration towards community conservation. But where do you think that stands currently? How can we help facilitate that change? And to what extent are there resources available that either catalog some of these amazing examples that you gave and that certainly exist in other parts of the country? Is anybody thinking of that or doing that? Maybe Armando, the resource that you mentioned, has that kind of network. Is the Alliance focused, not focused? Can you kind of provide
Mary, I think that the local land trusts have driven us this direction, actually. I think of lots of land trusts who are on the ground in their communities and much more in touch with what's going on and much more focused on providing value to their community. I think of Tom Bradbury in Kennebunkport, head of the local land trust, founded it. He's built the church. He's got this wonderful post and beam facility that they raised money for on a preserve. People come there for Tuesday night movies, All the lobstermen go to his website in the morning because he's got a webcam on the harbor. They can see what their boats are doing. They can see what the weather's like. So, that stuff's brilliant. And that's happening now. It's true. There are not going to be many two-people land trusts in America that are going to go raise $24 million and protect 22,000 acres. That's going to take the kind of work that Keith is talking about and the collaboration. And there are going to be land trusts that are not going to do much more than they're doing now. And maybe, fewer, bigger, longer is going to also apply, I think, in the land trust community. But I really do think the impetus for a lot of this work didn't start with the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Land and Maine Coast Heritage Trust. It started with the Kennebunkports and the Sudbury Valleys and places like that.
And just to mention, an opportunity we see is in the housing-oriented community land trust movement, getting together with the land conservation side land trust movement and working to a common purpose. And there's a lot of interest in moving that direction as well. Well, I think we're out of time, but let's thank Jay.